the Elected Official Compensation Commission, and we're here with our second meeting today. Let's go around the horn here and everybody introduce themselves, please. Kiana, you want to start?
Hi, Kiana Williams, Ohio Health. Is that all you needed?
Hi, Nia Walters, Columbus City Council.
Mike Brown, Chief of Staff for Columbus City Council President Shannon Harden.
Thought it was close enough. Good morning, Greg Beaverson, Department of Human Resources, Compensation Manager.
Zach Davidson, Policy Aide to Council President Harden.
Fred Rancier, Commissioner 2.0.
Keisha Hunley Jenkins, Boys and Young Men of Color Collective and the Equity Now Coalition.
Richard Blunt, Office of the Mayor.
Robert Tobias, Assistant General Counsel with the City Attorney's Office and Attorney for the Commission.
Okay, welcome all. This meeting is being broadcast. So our first item is Naya did what I thought was a very nice job giving us a summary of our last meeting. Are there any corrections or changes or additions that the commission or our support staff want to make? Okay, if none, then we'll proceed. And our first item is compensation best practices and parameters. Greg and Bill, I'm not sure, Greg Beaverson and Bill Lafayette, I'm not sure who goes first. Naya?
Bill will be going first this morning, Chair.
Okay. And Bill is remote. Do we see Bill or just hear Bill?
You'll be able to see him on the screens. Mark, can you go ahead and bring Bill up so that he can begin his presentation, please?
Here I am.
Good morning, Bill. This is my
Good morning.
Good day to you. We have a full commission here of the Elected Official Compensation Commission and city support staff. Welcome. And we understand you have a presentation on COLAs, and we'll let you proceed.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I just want to say thank you all and thanks to staff for letting me come to you virtually. I'm in a high-risk household, and we are trying to avoid any possibility of infection. The city charter ties official compensation, as you all know, to the Consumer Price Index. I've been asked to share some background on the CPI, what it measures, how it's calculated, and which of the thousands of CPIs you ought to use to benchmark compensation. The CPI is one of several alternative ways to measure inflation, which is a process of continually rising prices. In other words, continually declining value of money and purchasing power. In the state of inflation, a dollar doesn't buy as much as it did before. So the whole point of cost of living pay increases is to give the worker the same purchasing power that he or she had before inflation hit. The CPI is designed to measure inflation and how much the dollar's purchasing power has changed between two specific periods. The CPI is constructed by measuring the price of a predefined basket of goods and services at a particular time and place. The CPI is based on 80,000 prices of goods and services collected across 75 urban areas across the country. The prices of the item categories are weighted to approximate the purchasing patterns of a typical household. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys consumers' purchases to figure out what the correct weights of those prices ought to be. And the result of that is the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which forms the basis for figuring out the CPI. So, next slide, please, Mark. A price index is set up to show the path of price changes over time. You set the price level at an arbitrary specific date or a period to a particular value. That value's usually 100, and it's 100 in the CPI, but it doesn't have to be. The CPI's current base is actually not a date, it's a period. An average price between 1982 and 1984. The index value in each following month is based on the change in the value of your predefined basket relative to its price in the base month. So say the price of your basket at your base date is $1,000. So your price index is, by definition then, 100. Say the following month's price is $1,002 for that basket. So you calculate the index as the current month's price divided by the base date price times the base value of the index. Or in this case, 1,002 divided by 1,000 times 100, which is 100.2. By the following year, let's say the price of the basket has increased to $1,050. The index then is 1,050 divided by 1,000 times 100, or 105. In other words, you need $1,050 to buy the same things that 1,000 got you the year before. So how does that relate to the inflation rate? The inflation rate is easy to calculate from the CPI. You typically measure inflation from one year to the next, or from 1 month to the next. Monthly inflation rates are usually converted to annualized rates. In other words, what would be the inflation rate if the same monthly increase continued for the next 12 months? Next slide, please. You calculate inflation as the percentage change in the price index between your first and second date. So it's the CPI at the later date minus the CPI at the earlier date divided by the CPI at the earlier date. Or in other words, the later date divided by the earlier date minus 1. And that's the standard way to calculate a percentage change. Next slide. So in our example, the change in the index, one back, I think. No, it's right there, I'm sorry. The change in the index is 105 divided by 100 minus 1, so the inflation rate is 5%. In other words, you leave workers in the same position as they were last year by increasing their wages by 5%. So here I give you an example of calculating inflation using real numbers. The CPI in December 2019, you see, was 256.9. In December 2020, it was 260.1. And December 2021, it was 275.7. So the inflation between December 19 and December 2020 was 1.2%, and between December 2020 and December 21, it was 6%. So you calculate average inflation for a year using not these monthly values, but the average CPI for each year. And that's what I understand, will be doing in setting compensation. So if you'll turn the slides off, please. Now. There are 10,614 different CPIs, and these fall into several major groups. First of all, you have the type of consumer. You have the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, which is called the CPI-U. You have the Consumer Price Index for urban wage and clerical workers, which is the CPI-W. The difference between the CPI-U and the CPI-W is just the weighting of the items in the basket to reflect a lower income household in the CPI-W. The CPI-U covers about 93% of all consumers. The CPI-W covers only about 29%. Another dimension is the breadth of the basket. You have the CPI for all items, and then you have various subsets of those items. You have different general groups of goods and services. You have a CPI for food, CPI for energy, for services, for healthcare, for example. And you also have the CPI for a very large number of very specific items. For example, you can get a CPI for men's pants and shorts. And then there's a group of CPIs that don't include items but exclude them. The most common of these is the CPI for all items less food and energy. That's a CPI that economists and the Federal Reserve pay very close attention to. It's called the core CPI. The idea of excluding food and energy is that those prices are particularly volatile. So if you exclude them, that removes some of the noise from the CPI from one month to the next. Another dimension by which CPIs are measured is their geographical coverage. You have a U.S. city average, which covers the entire country, and then you have broad regions of the country, the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the West. And you also have 25 metro areas, one of which is not Columbus. You also have CPIs by the size of the metro area. Size A is 1.5 million or more, down to size D, which is less than 50,000. You also have regions interacted with the region size, so you can get Midwest size A CPIs. You have them seasonally adjusted and not seasonally adjusted. Seasonal adjustment takes account of changes in the prices of purchasing patterns that recur regularly at specific times during the year. One example is the price index in gasoline that you always see in late spring as refiners switch from their winter blend to their summer blend. Gasoline price increases at that point mean less than they do at other times during the year, so you want to exclude that impact. So seasonal adjustment then is a statistical technique that removes those impacts and it leaves you with the underlying trend. A seasonally adjusted change tells you how much more or less the change was than it typically is. So seasonal adjustment is important to use when you're going from one month to the next. When you're going from one year to the next, you want to use the unadjusted numbers. Finally, you have a series of 28 national level chained CPIs that are designed to address a big problem with the traditional CPI. That's my next topic. So the market basket that you use to determine the CPI is based on the purchase patterns of a typical consumer. People in different places, different ages, different household types, and different income levels spend differently. And so the fine print on the CPI should always read, "Your experience may vary." So the CPI for wage earners and clerical workers, the CPI-W, is a stab at addressing that problem. But unfortunately, it's the only stab that's readily available. You also have changes in the quality of the underlying goods. The CPI market basket includes a TV, but at some point that TV changed from black and white to color, and at some point it changed from a TV with a picture tube to a high-definition flat screen. The pace of change in technology-dependent goods, such as computers, is even faster than that. Each change typically results in a price index, but households really wouldn't perceive it that way because the new good delivers more satisfaction than the old good did. A flat screen TV is a whole lot better than one with a picture tube. So people over the years have experimented with ways to address these problems, but those fixes have been really difficult to implement, and so none of them have been. And that means that you have to be careful when you're looking at price changes over long periods, even the 4 years you're concerned with. There's no practical way to fix this problem. You just have to be aware that it exists. Another problem is the fact that purchasing patterns shift over time, but the market basket doesn't necessarily shift with them. Tastes change over time, new goods appear, and expenditure shares change as a result. And that means that the weights on the prices used to calculate the CPI become less relevant and less correct over time. The results of the Consumer Expenditure Survey are used to recalibrate the basket every 2 years. But substitutions of one good or one service for another happen a whole lot more dynamically than just every 2 years as the price of goods and services shift relative to one another. If the price of margarine goes up and the price of butter comes down, people switch from margarine to butter. If the price of movies goes up, fewer people go to movies and more people stream them at home or go bowling. The fact that the price of margarine and movies went up influences people's buying patterns, but once they've shifted away from the higher priced good, the higher prices of those items become less relevant than they were before when people were buying more of them. And that means that the CPI, with a basket that changes only every 2 years, overstates the actual financial impact of changing prices on households in real life. So the chained CPI is a response to the changes in the market basket because of new goods becoming available and because of relative prices changing. So it's calculated like the CPI, except the weights on the goods and services change every month based on the results of the monthly Consumer Expenditure Survey. Because it includes the impact of households' attempts to minimize the impact of rising prices, you expect the changed CPI inflation rate to be lower than the traditional CPI inflation rate was. And it generally is less, but it certainly hasn't been recently. The changed CPI inflation rate from December 2019 to December 2020 was 1.5% rather than 1.2%, and the changed inflation rate from December 2019 to or 2020 to December 2021 is 2.7% or is 6.9% rather than 6%. And that sounds great. There was a commission on deficit reduction back in 2010 that recommended the use of changed CPI in setting Social Security benefits, although it was much more because the changed CPI's measured inflation rate is lower than because it's theoretically better. So it was kind of a sleazy way to handle the problem. There is a very practical problem with the changed CPI, though, that makes it probably not the route that you want to take. The changed CPI values come out with all the others about 3 weeks after the end of the month. But because the Consumer Expenditure Survey only comes out with a 3/4 9-month lag, the index values for the past year or so are preliminary and they're revised a couple times before they're final. On the other hand, the traditional CPI values are final on their first release. So if you use the changed CPI to set pay levels, you need to go back and retroactively restate your adjustments. So there are several primary measures of price changes, as I said before, but the CPI probably is best for the purpose of setting cost of living increases on top of being the one that the city charter requires you to use. I understand that calculating pay increases based on a 4-year average is set in stone. I would certainly not have done that because it makes the pay escalation unresponsive to changes in inflation. It's what economists call sticky. So if inflation increases dramatically, as it has been lately, the wage adjustments increase much more slowly, and the officials wind up losing purchasing power. If inflation declines, the officials make out, but the city winds up paying out more in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. Thus, this 4-year window is unfair to everybody. The city and the officials both would have been much better off with an annual cost of living increase, but you're apparently not allowed to do that. So, which of the 10,614 CPI values should you use? It's better to go with an all items index rather than the core CPI that excludes food and energy, because while core inflation is a whole lot more stable, in real life, officials really do have to buy food and gasoline and natural gas, so it's unfair not to reflect that. The changed CPI is at least theoretically better, but you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. The rate for the past year, which is 1/4 of your wage adjustment, is very likely to change, perhaps materially. And you have to decide how you're going to handle that. Do you retroactively adjust people's pay for the incorrect initial rate, or do you leave it alone? In any case, if you're going to do that, you have to set a date on which you go out and retrieve the CPI values to avoid any conflict later on. That's not necessary with the CPI-U, the standard CPI, because, as I said, those values don't change once they're published. If you're going to use an annual average inflation rate, you have to use the non-seasonally adjusted CPI. In any case, measuring inflation year over year, even at a particular month, should also be done with the unadjusted numbers. Year over year, not month over month. For those, you have to use seasonally adjusted CPIs. As I said earlier, there's no CPI for Columbus, but there is one for Cincinnati and there's one for Cleveland. I never recommend that people use those CPIs for Columbus because Cleveland's and Cincinnati's demographics and economies are significantly different from those here. Also, individual city indices are much more volatile than national indices. I've used the CPI for all urban consumers, Midwest size class A, to measure Columbus inflation. That highlights the purchasing behavior of Midwesterners to a particularly great extent, and it includes information on Columbus prices to a greater extent than the national index does. But BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, recommends that people using the CPI to reflect the cost of living stick to the U.S. city average rather than any regional or city index because those are more volatile than the national index is. Now, you can argue this point either way, but it's probably best to do what the Bureau of Labor Statistics recommends and use the national index. So here I have a slide. Mark, if you want to pull it back up. One more. There we are. This is calculating the average inflation rate for the past 4 years. The CPI values and the inflation rates were as you see on the screen. And when you calculate a 4-year average, what you get is 2.54%, much less than the 2021 rate of 4.7% was. Now remember that the rate for the 12 months ending in December was 6%, and so what this is showing you is that we have very rapidly increasing inflation over the past several months. That 4-year average is, as I say, the largest adjustment that you can make. So you're adjusting officials' pay by 2.5% rather than the 4.7% or certainly the 6%. So if you use the Midwest CPI, you get what's on the next slide. And what you see there is a really more volatile series of inflation rates 1 year to the next, and you get 6.6% in 2021. And the 4-year average is 2.67%, which is not a whole lot different from what I got using the national index. Because although those individual rates are more volatile from 1 year to the next, once you take the 4-year average, you wash some of that volatility out. And that volatility is really just due to sampling error more than anything else. One more point that I have to bring up is that this very simple average is really not the best way to calculate these percentage averages. And I've shown you how really to do it in the handout that I gave you in footnote 3. And it's a whole lot more complicated. And in cases like this, it doesn't make for a whole lot of difference between what that gives you and what these simple averages give you. And really, that difference doesn't make a whole lot of difference unless you have negative inflation. And then it really does start to matter. So that is what I wanted to share. I assume we have time for questions.
Thank you, Bill. Commissioners, Fred?
As we are discussing these issues currently, we're in an inflationary pattern that public officials would argue is temporary.
Mm.
Do you have any comments about that? Because it certainly
Well,
it's going to affect the CPI for this year.
well, unfortunately, the jury is still very much out. The common thinking last year was that this really was going to be just a transitory impact, and it was going to settle down probably by the first quarter of this year. That is now. The thinking now, and I follow the National Association for Business Economics quarterly forecast surveys, and those for the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, those that the Philly Fed puts out. And they are upping their predicted inflation on a very regular basis for this year. Recently, they were predicting that we would get maybe 2.1, 2.2%. Now they're saying that it's not going to settle down even to 2.5% until the fourth quarter. So we really don't know yet. What we do know is it's going to be a whole lot less transitory than we thought it would be last year.
And I presume from the presentation that the consumer price index, therefore, is increasing.
Yeah, 6% December to December.
Okay.
The highest rate of increase since 1984.
1934?
84.
84.
84, oh, okay. Thank you.
Other commissioners, comments or questions? Staff, is there any comments or questions you might add? Okay, Bill, thank you for your presentation. Is Bill still available to us in future discussions if we need him?
Absolutely. Just contact me. Oh, and one final point, one last point. I have in the handout that I gave you an attachment where I walk you through retrieving these CPI values step by step.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
All right, thank you all.
Next on our agenda is a presentation by Greg Beaverson from Human Resources.
Battery's gone, I think.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. While the slides are getting pulled up here, All of the commissioners should have a copy of these slides. There you go. And Mark, I'll test this just to make sure. Hey, great, it works. Commissioners, you asked at the last meeting for a presentation on compensation best practices. Essentially, I normally refer to it as Comp 101, that kind of thing, just to kind of give a foundation and some support to what we're doing in terms of surveying, the analysis of the data that we come back with, and ultimately what you have available to you to make an informed decision at the end of the process. So to that end, that's what I have here. This is it's a collection of information, yes, but also questions that I typically receive from employees, people who are generally interested in compensation and how it works, not just for elected officials, but for anyone who has a job and gets paid by an employer, and in this case, a taxpayer. The market, how does this work? How do we end up deciding, pardon me, what the market is when the council amendment, pardon me, the charter amendment actually refers to the market in terms of other public officials? Well, we have to start off with the definition for that. So what we have here, the market is the prevailing salary of a given job and answers the question, what are employers willing to pay for this job? There are several considerations when we look at the market and consider it. The level of responsibility, comparable region, local, state, and national. And we had that discussion during the first commission meeting about the cities and other jurisdictions you wished to study. Number of employees in the organization. So comparing an organization with for example, the city of Columbus has just about under 10,000 employees, 900 and some thousand people in the city. We wouldn't necessarily compare Columbus then with my hometown of Bell Center, Ohio, population 950. So there are differences there. At the same time, we also wouldn't compare ourselves with New York City, the largest city in the nation, just under 9 million people there. So those are all considerations. And again, we went over those numbers in terms of what cities and jurisdictions you'd like to study. And obviously population figures into that as well. This list is not all inclusive. There are other things, of course, that we typically think about. Salaries of actual employees are collected and the median is determined, and that is what the market is. However, when I usually provide that definition, there's always a question that comes up, well, what is the median? I've always heard about the average, which is another name for the mean. The median is more useful for several reasons, and that's what I'd like to touch on. I also wanted to mention pay ranges. Pay ranges are typically arbitrary and are not useful in determining the market. So what I actually get employees coming to me and saying, well, this, a similar job somewhere else has this pay range with this really high maximum rate. And my response usually is, well, theoretically, a company, a public sector employer, could set a pay range from minimum wage to $200 an hour. So I don't know if they think that they would need to make $200 an hour based on a scenario like that, but pay ranges don't really mean a lot unless there's unless there is research and general compensation practice behind it. So pay ranges are not something that we typically look at. We look at the market. The next slide here regarding the median. It's preferred over the mean or the average, and it represents the greater tendency. Median is just a Latin word for middle. For example, if we chose these numbers, 5, 10, 50, 100, and 100,000, 50 is the median. It is literally the middle number. But it's quite different if you look at the average or the mean, which is 20,033. So yes, of course, this is an extreme example, but when we look at and compare ourselves to cities with, and this happened last time, and I'm certain it will happen again this time, where, for example, a mayor's salary is extraordinarily high, one or two times or so higher than our mayor's salary, compared to another city where the mayor took a massive pay cut for reasons I don't remember or want to try to describe, but took a very large pay cut. So, a mayor getting paid $30,000 or $40,000 for a similarly sized city, and then a mayor getting paid $250,000, $300,000 for a similarly sized city, that's where the median comes into play. If we were to average those out, we would end up with a different number that is less accurate than what we would want. And forgive me for reading here a little bit. For our purposes, some elected officials are paid much less because the job is part-time, it's not equivalent to the same job elsewhere, or they've taken a voluntary significant cut in pay. This is where the median is more representative of the true market. And then the last part of that discussion is what we call the market window. Some organizations, public and private sector, do not use a market window. Many do. And a market window, again, forgive me for reading here a little bit, when it comes time for comparison, salaries will rarely exactly match the market rate. Therefore, a market window pardon me, is useful in determining whether a job is at, below, or above market. So to put that in simpler terms, for example, if we've determined that the market rate is $50,000, pardon me, the competitor's salary is $48,000. If we establish a window of plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10%, any place in between, then what we have is a market rate. $48,000 can be considered market. An established window of plus or minus 5% would produce acceptable market rates of $47,500 to $52,500. Therefore, the comparator salary of $48,000 would be considered to be within market. Otherwise, what we find ourselves doing, and I have this challenge with our the pay structures, the tables that we have for our several employee groups, is that when I go out to do a market study on a particular particular job, it will rarely hit that exact same middle number that we define as the market rate in our pay structure. So these plus or minus windows are helpful for that reason. And we don't end up saying, well, we're paying below market or we're paying above market. We're actually at market using this window. And I think I'm repeating myself here. Organizations can choose to set the width of the market window or can choose not to have one. But compensation best practice typically falls within the range of plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10%. What we do for employees typically is the plus or minus 10%. So you're aware of that. And that's all I had on this part. I wanted to stop and ask if there were any questions about this. Certainly I'm available to follow up with any requests or questions you might have later. But I do have one other slide I wanted to show the commission before I was finished.
Commissioners, questions, comments?
So, go ahead, Fred.
The work that we're going to do, how does it, this is elected officials, obviously. Does it have an impact on collective bargaining? plus or minus.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, does it have an impact on collective bargaining?
So we're going to set a salary structure for our elected officials. Does that have an impact upon collective bargaining in the sense that if the mayor makes this, I should make that? Or can we look at this as a clean slate, separate and apart from collective bargaining?
Yes, Commissioner. But my opinion is that it will have no impact on collective bargaining. That is not typically something that the bargaining units make comparisons to in both my knowledge and in my recollection of negotiations. It simply is what it is. It's elected official salaries, and not to contradict your statement, but instead of pay ranges for elected officials like union employees have, we're actually setting are actually setting that actual number, no range, nothing below, nothing above, and then my job every year for the next 4 years. The 4 years after, when this becomes effective, is to utilize the CPI that Dr. Lafayette discussed and to make those adjustments year after year. Yes, sir.
So Greg, my question is related to your definition of market. So in my experience, generally when we define market, we also take into consideration where a job can be done, right? So for instance, if I'm hiring recruiters at Ohio Health and the recruiters can only do their job in Columbus, then I would only look at the Columbus market versus region. So when we look at the surveys, they can be informative, but technically that's not the market for these jobs because the mayor of Columbus can only be the mayor in Columbus.
Absolutely, Commissioner. And that is one of the challenges of surveying in the first place, is that we can keep going down and down and down and getting closer and closer and closer to what true comparators are. But after a while, we really end up spending more time doing that than we do the actual surveying. But yes, to your point, that for example, it's the type of job. We recently hired a new public safety director. I would not have just looked at public safety director salaries in the state of Ohio, and certainly not in Columbus. I instead went nationally. However, the opposite end of the spectrum would be a custodian. I would not be looking at salaries of custodians in San Francisco or Chicago or Denver or any place like that. We would keep that here within Columbus. So yes, certainly the region, the type of job that it is, employees, or in this case, population served, all figures into that. And that's where we ended up, I believe, with that list that was presented to the commission the last time, which takes many of those things into consideration.
Other questions, comments?
I have a question. 2 questions, please. The first one is a quick one. The past, and maybe, Fred, you might know the answer to this one. Did you all select 5 or 10% for the market parameters, or do you recall what that was?
Oh, what it was last time? Mm-hmm. I believe it was 5%, and I thought I was going to be prepared for that question, and I neglected to go look it up. So I will find that out and get back to the commission.
I'm sorry, Fred?
My brain is 4 years older, retains less.
Thank you. And then my second question, I think I know the answer to this, but just for clarity, are our city council members, are they part-time, are they full-time, are they part-time with benefits? Could you please explain that?
There's the $64,000 question right there.
Yeah. Oh, you will.
And
Oh,
so,
okay.
Greg, you say, to that end, you say, for our purposes, some elected officials are paid much less because the job is part-time. So I've go way back on this issue, and most, all have said once upon a time the job was part-time. I don't really hear that in recent time. And it's always been when does a part-time job become a full-time job? I guess is the kind of question that it really begs. I just throw that out there. I think this whole issue is the 400-pound gorilla in the room, and I don't think that it's ever been, well, to my knowledge, commissioners with the history, I don't know what you did 4 years ago about that, but I think we do need to have a conversation about what it means to be part-time, are council members part-time, et cetera.
Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't want to overstep my bounds and attempt to answer that question in too great a detail. I know Mike is going to cover a little bit of that. My understanding has always been, though, that I believe it's in the charter, but maybe I am overstepping a little bit here, but I believe it's part-time to answer it. To answer the question. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nowhere in code or in the charter does it define that council is part-time or full-time, so it is an ongoing question, really. And so I think when I'm thinking about our work, maybe considering to think about this as like, if it's decided they are part-time, what should they get paid? Or if it's decided they're full-time, what should they get paid? So I think that's going to come down to the commission to kind of look at it in both ways. And I was actually going to just suggest potentially looking at it and maybe potentially giving recommendations on both sides in case that ever changes, that there is an opportunity to look, we know directly, like if they're part-time, this is what they should be getting paid. If they're full-time, this is what they should be getting paid. So I think it's a question that you all, if you so choose, may continue to discuss, but there isn't a designation in charter or code as it relates to the status of council members as part-time or full-time.
And it is my recollection that this question came up the last time, and I think that we grapple with the same thing that Naya is talking about right now, making that delineation, but also whether or not they should be full or part-time. I think that we did start that conversation, but I don't think that there was resolution on that. Greg, I'm sure you can check the notes on that as well.
From my recollection, Commissioner, that's correct. I will say that when we look at salaries here for city employees, part-time does not figure into it as much as you might think. The reason for that is because we look at duties. The general compensation practice is when we're comparing and contrasting job duties, at least 70% of those duties must be the same. That's why we don't care about pay ranges, and we really don't care about job titles. And I think I covered a little bit last time about the difference, or at least in the title itself, between a city auditor and a city controller. And I think I've seen a couple of other names for what essentially is our city auditor. So what we do instead is we look at the duties. What does the job entail itself? Whether the person is part-time or full-time, they're still responsible for completing the same duties of the job. So why should their pay be any different, or at least much different, if they're simply doing it for 20 hours a week as compared to 40 hours a week?
The complication, I think, with that is you could have a council that had, in terms of time consumption, you could have a council member that really was part-time, and then another one that was full-time in terms of time consumption. And then you say, what are the duties? Well, the council members, to a certain extent, decide what the duties are. Mm-hmm. For instance, are they going to attend this or that commission meeting, meet with constituents, or that would require a great deal of time? You could be a full-time council member doing that kind of work. So it's complicated.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, the duties for elected officials are even more so complicated in that sense when you compare and contrast duties. My reference was to our City of Columbus employees and kind of the general practice that we use just in the compensation profession overall. But absolutely 100% the duties, what a council member does is largely defined by the council member, of course. See, there was something else I was going to say there.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I was on city council in
Fred, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you move closer? I'm sorry.
I was on city council in 2020, and obviously compensation was thought to be part-time, and I had a full-time practice of law. I see things quite differently today than I did then, and Kiana, you're absolutely correct. I'm sure I would have raised this issue in our discussions last time. I think it's a combination of several things that the public should expect. And I don't know if this is where we begin to set those types of expectations. The city is much larger. It's the largest city. It's one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing in the Midwest. There's dramatic change afoot. Not only will we have 9 council members, but we're going to have a tech-based economy with much higher salaries. So I can foresee the combination of growth and, natural growth, and then the growth brought about through our economic development, a push up. Should we not expect, I think the question becomes, should we not expect, either through compensation or otherwise, that these are full-time employees? It disturbed me. It seems like every year since 2020, or every election of a new council member, there was a coffee about what do we do about making up the difference. And the larger the city grew, the more conflicts were created, right? This is a zero-sum game. We have a budget of $100, so if I give you 50, that's 50 less to give to somebody else. It's zero sum. And so the work required becomes a lot more thoughtful, I believe, in order to maintain pace with the growth of our region. Recently a council member just took a job. I just remember in the last month or two. I have a very strong opinion about it. I'll leave that, but you'll probably figure it out based upon my comments. It's not the council member's problem. The problem is council member, obviously, she's telling us we're not being paid enough to do our duties. I think that's what they're saying. So back to Mike. Yeah, there are council members who very much look at this part-time. But should that be what we expect? Is that what the community should expect from our public servants? We've had to increase the size of council to meet the growth, and we're growing at even a more rapid pace. So when we're talking about 2026, is that what this is about? If I look out to 2026, some dramatic change since the year 2000 in this community, and if the public wants the quality of individual to help us to continue to grow, I can't see this being a part-time job, personally.
Sarah, do you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Nothing in particular to add. I do they think that it is? And then also just kind of getting more feedback and moving forward in that conversation. Because I do think that that's really important. Is it a part-time position? Is it a full-time position? If it is so part-time that it's almost full-time, that would provide benefits and all those other kinds of things. It makes your numbers very different, and it should.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm sure we're going to be discussing this more. Please, go ahead.
I have just two questions, two requests and two questions. So, Mr. Beaverson, any records that you or anyone else has about what's been discussed on this topic in the past, just so we have that? And I love Sarah's idea of like a current understanding of council members or, what they think. Also, the same thing for the market rate. What has this compensation commission typically done with regard to the 5 or 10%? And then the last questions I have, and, if you have answers for them, great, are, if council member, what is the pay now? Is the pay full-time, part-time, somewhere in between? Like, how would you categorize it when you look at it? And then the second question is, if this commission or a future commission, decides to make it full-time, then would that preclude council members from holding other employment? Thank you.
Okay, those are, I think that was a good discussion or beginning. And we'll, I'm sure, be discussing it further. Let's move on, if we could.
Excuse
Do
me,
you have
Mr.
anything
Chairman.
to say, Greg, on the Pierce City survey?
Yes, sir, I do. I did want to mention, before we move on to that, if I may, that we do have a question on the survey, and we ask that question, is your council member, and actually I believe we ask it about all of the elected officials, but specifically, is your council member part-time or full-time? And then we ask the same question for the council president. So we'll have that data when that comes back. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that, Mr. Chairman.
Can I ask a question about that? So when you are sending the survey, are you just designating the difference between council president and council member? Or like we have council pro tem, who also takes on a significant amount of the duties, right? How is that divided in the survey?
It is, Commissioner, it is only council president and council member is how we have that listed.
And finally, who is being surveyed?
Pardon?
Who is being surveyed?
I can provide you with a list.
Well, maybe more specifically, is this a general public survey? Is this an internal survey? What's the breadth of the...
No, Commissioner, it's actually the same list of the 24 other cities we surveyed last time.
Okay, I just misunderstood.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And then, Mark, if you could go back to the slideshow. There should be one other slide. And, Mr. Chairman, this answers your question from a minute or two ago. Here we go. I just wanted to give the commission a survey update, kind of where we are. Of the 24 cities surveyed so far, I have, it's actually up to 6 responses now, but I can't call them complete. Kansas City got back to me, it was either yesterday or Monday, and sent me most of it, but they were waiting on some, I think, some budget numbers. That is a 21% response rate, which if you know anything about surveying, that's actually pretty good. I'm confident we'll do even better. If I remember from last time, it was somewhere in the 60s. But so far, 21%. And the due date that I requested is Friday, February 11th. That's a week from this Friday. So I just wanted to provide that information and kind of where we are at this point.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's move on to a discussion of the new 9-member council from Chief of Staff for City Council, Mike Brown. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Chair Kassler, members of the commission,
all of our staff friends here today, especially Nia Walters with our Legislative Research Office, Mr. Tobias, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Davidson, Mr. Beaverson. Appreciate all the time being put into this. It is, I think, maybe the most complex version of this commission we've ever seated because of the changes that are afoot. And that's one reason we were so focused on bringing in especially Mr. Ranciere with some experience in this area, but also all of you because you have such interesting backgrounds. And it's very important that we get those voices at the table. To answer a previous question, just to keep some context going, the current right now, as of I think 2 weeks ago, maybe 3, the council member makes $72,300 a year. And as you know, in the even local nonprofit sector, where many of them are or could be employed, a CEO, executive director type role is often the 150 to 250 range. And that's somewhat anecdotal, but I think the research would back that up. The council president is currently paid $86,977,000. And this is all based on the work of the last previous commission 4 years ago and was a significant increase from where it was before, I believe 20%. Showing just how far many of the members would argue they were behind initially and the changing demands of this operation. I have prepared some comments for context. Nia Walters had asked me to talk a little bit about philosophy and history, so I'll start there, but I am going to get into the full-time, part-time question just a little bit. Very intentionally from the council president and the members, not trying to steer outcomes in any way. We want to give some context, though, and be available as you do your debating, and then can bring us back some feedback. They kind of know where they are, but we want to hear from other people. So first off, Council President Hardin sends his appreciation and also to the thank you to the work of Dr. Bill Lafayette. Good morning. Thank you for allowing us to bring testimony this morning as you consider this charge. In 2023, we're going through a historic change as approved by the voters and discussed really for at least a generation, the first major change to council size and structure since 1914. It's a very important change, and it did not come without significant debate. We're growing the representative elected body, our legislature for our fine city, from 7 to 9 members, as recommended by charter review commissions in the past, and multiple efforts by various different groups of residents that went to the ballot several times even. The one that finally went to the ballot and was victorious won with about 75% support, though. And you're helping parallel work with how we implement that. To be clear, we did not create and did not desire a political ward system, and we think that is very important. We believe that they can sometimes pit neighborhoods against neighborhoods and create even a corrosive and corrupting impact upon bodies. We wanted something that there was still accountability across the entire city while having someone who you knew lived nearby in your neighborhood and understand and saw the things that you saw every day. Voters approved these residency requirements for members, creating districts to make sure that they're spread out among our very diverse growing neighborhoods. And anyone who's lived here, as I have now for some 22, 23 years, the growth here is dynamic. It is remarkable. We are very fortunate to live here at this time, but it's creating some challenges of growth. The members strongly believe that residents want to know their government is out there, though. Their elected officials are there, seeing the problems where they live. You got to know where the potholes are and where the broken sidewalks are, and then you just take the escalator of city services up the chain. Whatever it is, they want to know that someone sees what they see and aren't condensed to one or another area of town. And now that we're over 224 square miles and approaching 1 million residents, that is challenging. We do believe that the city has been well run, but these changes are going to increase our neighborhood representation and ensure that we can continue to work for Columbus in a way that holds members accountable also to the people they live close to. As Columbus grows, we must continue to be the best, and it's a very sincere effort to embrace change and help us reach our potential, especially some of the things that this group has already brought up today, that the coming changes are going to only accelerate our growth. We're dealing with some of the internal issues now, and those who serve in the bureaucracy side of things, we do have to begin planning now for things like budgets, staffing. If you all saw just the debates we have over office space, the thought of adding 6 new people is going to be a little bit challenging right now because City Hall is almost 100 years old and knocking down walls is not as easy as it used to be. But we have to figure out those things, and your advice is going to help us do that. A couple things that we want to talk about include council members' responsibilities. This is what came up earlier. We haven't modeled it yet, but after listening to today's discussion, I think that is some of the assignments that we're going to put on our people. What is the legal responsibilities? What is the bare minimum that a member has to do? Historically, I think a member could come in maybe on Mondays and Fridays and really have a good idea what was going on with the legislative agenda. They could talk to their staff and be like, hey, we're ready to go. This is good stuff. Thank you. I had my committee meetings with the directors. It is becoming ever more difficult, especially as residents really want to talk to their elected officials. And I know some of our members do an incredible job of outreach. Councilmember Emmanuel Remy is one example who does regular coffees, virtual coffees, whatever it is he needs to do, but he does it either every other week or monthly for hours, and whoever shows up. But that is just one of the many ways that we get input. Because at the end of the day, that is the first job, as the council president is always reminding us, this room is the people's house, city council is the people's body. We're the ones most responsive and have the requirement of listening to people. Anyone can come down here on a Monday night in a council meeting and get their 3 minutes at the microphone. We are very intentional about that and protecting those rights of the citizens to approach their government and talk to us. But it's not just the city council meetings. It's also all of the hearings that we have, just like this one today. The meetings with constituents that are daily. We do intentional bus tours. We actually take our neighborhood hearings out to the neighborhoods when we can in a non-COVID era and do them in rec centers. And all the members will go out there and spend hours with our residents listening. That is the first job of this body, we believe. Second, though, is to take everything that we hear and implement it as we review the legislation that comes before us. I think somewhere on average between 3,200 and 3,600 ordinances a year, including the city budget that we just passed of $1.03 billion this past Monday, or will be passing at our next meeting. We amended this week. These are important things for the future of our city, and they require a lot of meetings. Members also serve as committee chairs. As you know, whether it's the Public Service Commission, or the Public Service Committee, the Public Safety Committee, these all require them to meet with the administration, to meet with staff, to meet with our police and fire chiefs, to help us not only make sure that the budgets are being spent properly, but also what is the next idea in reimagining safety? How do we take these priorities of the people through the members to the administration to actually get something done? It does require time and work, and the City Council is required by charter to meet. These Monday meetings are actually required, and there's more than 60 of them that we have to do, and that includes all regular and zoning meetings where members actually vote. And as you know, they're all on Mondays, and you're welcome to come down and join us. This is a very simplified version, though, of the job description. And so one thing that we are going to look at for this commission is can we create some sort of model based on talking to a couple of members and their real calendars? What does it really look like? And you all know that you have what you plan at work and you have what really happens at work, right? And that we should be able to draw you some sort of at least anecdotal map of this is what it's like to be a city council member in the demands. I can tell you right now, though, that 6 of the 7 members currently have outside employment. Whether it's being a realtor or running a local nonprofit, they are engaged and they feel that they need to be. One, there's passion for it, but also their households have a financial number. And if you're going to pay the mortgage, you have to have employment. Largely, though, I think our members currently are in the nonprofit sphere, which is not unusual for Columbus. We have a long history of that, whether Matthew Habash was at the food bank and still is at the food bank, and many others. But it's somewhere where I know that it creates huge time demands. The reality is that we also, though, must take seriously that external employment can create conflicts of interest, which are not only, could be, let's just say, a lot of work that's added on to others if you can't, say, have a member or two voting on an ordinance, but it creates all kinds of other potential conflicts that even can get into the ethical sphere and the legal sphere. We do everything we can to protect the members from ever having to be in that situation, but Ordinance X, if you aren't actually going through it all and doing all the detailed work, could have vendor Y, and then suddenly you had, oh, I didn't know. We do everything we can to avoid those conflicts, but I have to tell you, it is real and it adds stress to the situation. It also then prevents a member from possibly voting on things that they truly support, but because their organization is here and the geography around it could be affected, suddenly they can't even speak on that issue. It creates conflicts and that creates stress on the system. The ethics we take very seriously. We actually hired, as a city, a chief ethics officer, currently serving Renata Ramzini, who spends a lot of time on this, by the way. But it's something that we must be very vigilant about. In this area, I want to also know that there are questions of equity. I think this was touched on just a little bit. But as a council, our ability to make sure that future members represent a true city, right? And if you have to make a financial decision not to serve, then you will never run. And that takes out some of our best people just because they have to be able to pay for their household bills. Equity is very important as we look to the future, but keeping members part-time, it does mean that it's very likely that outside employment will be not only likely, but pretty much needed. And I know they all struggle with that on a regular basis. We do not want to lose out on quality candidates who could run for city council based on us not being competitive in the market that Dr. Bill described and Greg discussed in his presentations. We do believe that our members feel they should focus as much as possible on representing the residents of city, all the things that we do that affect the entire region, and keep the city as a lighthouse, really, in the state of Ohio and the Midwest for our values as well as the success of what a city can be heading into the future. A few other items that council as an entity must deal with after the recommendations of this commission. I've mentioned before, budgeting and staff growth. For each member, there are 2 staff, an aide and assistant. So as we add 2 members, we will be adding 4 other staff. We do not anticipate, aside from salaries, significant additional hiring around this change. So that is really where that is bureaucratically. Harking back on this full-time, part-time question, full outside employment, I will say, definitely leaves members more reliant upon staff. And at the end of the day, staff is not elected. And as much as I love my job, and I love the service I provide to the 7 members, especially our council president, I was not elected. I serve at the pleasure, but I do believe that over-reliance on the bureaucracy takes away a little bit of what is supposed to be representative democracy, and our members want to be available to the residents. So our goal is to ensure the maximum availability. Then we do need to have this discussion. And we are looking to you to help us have that discussion and really dive into it. I believe that summarizes kind of how we got to today. I don't think we need to go into the campaigns of 2016 and 2018. We're now on the verge of this change. We will be collecting signatures for candidates this year. It begins. So we will have I could imagine a world in which 20 or 30 people run for office to be city council members in November of 2023. We have to do our jobs to make sure that the city is ready to take the change on and easily bring them in, a smooth transition to keep our government going and to keep our progress going. So with that, I would be available for any questions. I've also brought around Zachary Davidson, who is a part of our team and really the policy mind who worked on a lot of the changes back when we did the ballot initiative. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mike. I guess to that end, Zach, do you have anything to add? Okay, thanks. I would just observe on the years I've watched the things going on at City Hall. Most council members, as I recollect, have had other employment. Seemed like 40 years ago, they were working for utility companies and banks. Today, they're working, that's a bit of a stretch, but some did. And today, we have more of them employed in the nonprofit sector. Is that a fair observation?
I would say that is exactly correct. There's a big difference between the 90s, the aughts, and our current period. And it is almost entirely nonprofit sector, except I think one.
Yeah. So it kind of begs the question, do you want your council members working for utility companies and banks and other corporate entities? They may not have the conflicts that nonprofit corporations do, but it's still a question I just throw out there.
I think it creates perceived conflicts regardless in either direction. And I know I actually hear from both sides on our external partners, well, you need to have more of a business attitude or you need to have more of a human services attitude. And then from residents, they're like, well, you're too close to X. Whatever X is always seen as a perceived threat and an ethical challenge. And that is something we have to wrestle with.
Commissioners, comments,
I
questions?
just wanted to add to your point here. In my recollection, and it may still be the case, that the aide, who is the full-time person, who is in front of the public, but is not in a decision-making capacity, makes more money than the elected official. And at the time, I was in office 3 times the amount of the council member. The policy was really being addressed by staff because of the workload, the imbalance of keeping a job, supporting a family, doing all the other things. I'd come to a meeting, you're chair of Parks and Recreation, here are the resolutions we need to get passed today. I had very little to do with how it was formulated, who did you meet with, what was the constituency that generated this, was it generated internally, externally? Those matters are really not, the council member wasn't engaged. Now I'm talking 2020, so now we're in 2022. I ask, has that changed?
I would have to get you the exact numbers, but just off the top of my head, city council is a fairly small body, right? We have about 35 staff members total, including the clerk's office, and 7 elected officials, so 42. And I would estimate at least 12 of the 35 make more than the council president.
Commissioner Renzier, to your specific question about aides and their pay, I pulled up the salary data. The median salary for an aide is just under $77,000. So to your point, the median aide still makes slightly more than the median council member salary, which would be the non-council president salary. So it's not 3 times what it was, but it is effectively equal.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Mike or Greg, we knew we had to catch up 4 years ago. It was a catch-up that we were implementing. We had fallen, as I recall, we had fallen behind, and we were very intentional about trying to catch up.
So to that point, there was a 20% increase for council members and council president last time, or 20% per council, I think for council members and for council president last time. So to your previous point, it may have been a lot more separation in past years, but with that 20% increase, which took effect on January 1st of this year, that put, I guess, council members and the council president, I guess, in a more competitive space as it comes to pay with aides in terms of closeness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
And, well, I think a couple things, because it's starting to feel to me a little bit like we're conflating different things, and I just want to make sure that we're making apples to apples comparisons across the way. So absent of data understanding why an aide may be making more than a council member, right? Because we don't know what the market is for the aides yet. So it would be helpful to understand that, Greg, if we are going to be making that comparison. The other thing that would be helpful to me is, in part, it sounds like we're comparing the CEO and executive director of a nonprofit to a council member. In my mind, very different roles. But again, if that's what we're making a comparison to, I'd like to have, a better understanding of the responsibilities that we think align those two types of roles. And then, there's a lot being made of conflicts of interest. If they are full-time, part-time, there are always going to be conflict of interest, right? Where your wife works, where your husband works, so on and so forth, could create a conflict of interest. And so we sign conflict of interest statements every day at my job. So no matter where you work, you're going to have those. Absolutely, they're heightened when you're an elected official. But you're getting donations every single day as well. And so that could also potentially create a conflict of interest. So I just want to make sure that as we're putting things into kind of our database of decision making, that it really is things that are going to make a difference and things that are going to be changed by whatever the outcome is. And conflict of interest aren't going to be changed by the decisions that we make here because they're always going to exist. And then the last thing I do want to say is I agree with Fred's point about part-time versus full-time. We absolutely should reconcile that. It does, feel to me like it should be full-time, similar to what Fred is saying. However, I don't think that the fact that people are getting outside employment tells us that the salaries aren't the right salaries. You may just want a higher standard of living. You may just want a certain type of house. And so again, I think that the data has to drive our decision versus us assuming that somebody getting a second job means that the current salary is out of line. That's my only concern, is just because somebody gets a second job doesn't mean that what we're paying them isn't an adequate salary. And then a request, Greg, and I don't know if it's you or if it's, I just forgot his name, Regionomics. Bill, thank you. So number one, the median worker salary, because one of the things that I feel like we're comparing right now is what do aides make versus what do elected officials make, but what is the median worker in Central Ohio making, and how does that compare to what our elected officials are making? And then when we looked at the inflation number, so the rise in inflation was like 6%. What is the growth in the average worker's wage in Central Ohio? Because if it's not keeping pace with that inflation, then to me to say that our elected officials should be keeping pace when essentially they're getting paid by taxpayer dollars, and if taxpayer income isn't growing at the same rate, I think that we have a challenge in saying that it should be an apples-to-apples comparison. I do want to say this. I absolutely think we need to make an adjustment in the compensation. I just want to make sure that we do it based in fact and not in other things.
Commissioner, I'd be happy to provide that information. I can get that.
Thank you, Kiana. I think those were all points well taken. For instance, on that cost of living, there are a lot of people in Columbus that are retired and they're on Social Security. What's the Social Security COLA? It's something to consider.
Right.
Point well taken. Thank you. Commissioners, other comments or questions?
I don't have anything to add. Thank you, Commissioner Williams. And I just wanted to say that I know I asked about this earlier, but I think it just keeps coming up over and over. Their current compensation and benefits, is that considered part-time or full-time? And if it can't be sharply categorized in that way, which way are we leaning? Because so many of these questions, when we're looking at these numbers, if this is a true part-time salary, then maybe the jump isn't as big as it would be, or whatever, but we don't have any, well, I should say I don't have any frame of reference for that at this time.
Commissioner, the benefits are full-time benefits. In terms of whether it's considered part-time or full-time in terms of the salary, I believe that is what the last commission was attempting to adjust for council members.
You believe that they attempted to adjust to make it a full-time salary?
To make it more equivalent to other
Okay.
full-time council member positions around the country.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, and that adjustment was a 20%? Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
For both
Okay.
council president and council members.
Okay.
I think I would just like to echo Commissioner Williams' comments that talking about outside employment is almost irrelevant to me, because even if we consider council full-time and we assign salaries that would reflect a full-time salary, that does not mean that they would be precluded from seeking outside compensation in other forms, unless that changes with, the charter or elsewhere. But theoretically, you still could have a full-time council member who has outside employment. So I think in my brain, I'm leaning toward, I don't really care what the outside employment situation is or what salaries people are wanting. It's really just, does the compensation commiserate with, what they're actually making? And I do think that it's important for us to understand the duties and how much time each of these positions are really putting in an effort to do a good job. And I'm sure that there is some disparity between, how people see themselves as council members. But that would be really helpful to me.
I think we don't have to guess about this. We know of council members who left council in turn to take jobs or ran for positions while sitting on council that compensated more, like becoming judges or, other jobs, looking at a plate now.
City attorney, for instance.
City attorney is an example. It was out of the necessity of securing income to support a family. I can't disagree whether a person needs to or doesn't need to. Does this job require full 100% attention or not? The employer takes on the risk of conflicts. Again, this is a job, it's a zero-sum game job here. We have a budget of X dollars, that's all we have to spend. And if we're going to decide on roads, and I represent Linden, that means the South Side, whatever Linden gets, the South Side doesn't get. And if your nonprofit is affecting this one way or the other, that means you probably can't vote at all on roads. Wherever those dollars land, at my level of ethical considerations, or economic development, that's probably even more relevant to a nonprofit. If you can't play in that game, you've taken once you've taken yourself out of that, how much of the budget have you taken yourself away from? What aren't you representing the general public on? So economic development, I think, would be a good piece. That's of our discretionary dollars. A lot has been thrown that way. It has helped build the community in which we live. But if my nonprofit is dealing in any way in economic development, I suppose I have an hour conflict. What percentage of my job as a council member gets erased because of that? That's how I see it. That's the problem I see. And the public will ultimately determine, do you want a person who can't help you I'm going to elect somebody who really can't help you on a lot of issues. They're not going to be in their seats when the discussions come up and the votes are taken.
But Fred, I think that you make a great point, but you make trade-offs every single day in your practice, right? And it's the same thing here, right? Like, when you become an elected official, you have to make certain trade-offs. And so I think my point isn't that those things don't matter. They absolutely matter. But at the end of the day, when we're making compensation decisions, right, the data should determine how much.
I need all the data.
Yeah.
I'm not assuming. I don't assume what I am expressing. These are just concerns. And my concerns are not anecdotal. I look around at the names on this of the people who have sat down with me and said, I wasn't sure what I did when I decided to leave a job making considerably more money to take this job. I'm in the paper every day, but I can't bring home milk. I mean, there has to be, we have to guide people into what they are approaching. And as the city grows, as the city became more involved, it probably still 80-90% of the budget's going to go to police and fire. But that 20%, the number of fingers that are entering it and the size of it and the scope of it as we continue to expand communities, build new roads, the city's being asked to contribute to that. The city's being asked to contribute to the hospital at OSU. Have a bigger budget than the city has. It's kind of, I just say, the data will drive the decision. I'm just kind of looking out there and seeing what's happening, and I'm questioning. Would a $1 billion institution be paying its paid board of directors $70,000 a year? $1 billion institution who influencing 1 million residents? Not sure. Not sure. So then that means that the person with those qualifications will never get to city council. They'll never get here.
And while we're talking about the dollars, much discussion of a general fund with a $1 billion budget. When you look at the enterprise funds we operate a regional water and sewer authority, essentially. They're spending upwards to that amount. And then you look at the city's capital improvement budget, which annually, I'm sure, probably goes over $1 billion. So if you just want to talk about the dollars and cents of budgets, it's really probably between $3 and $4 billion a year, I'm guessing. Am I right there, Zach? Over $2 billion? Okay, I was stretching it a little, pardon me. I stand corrected, thank you. But nevertheless, the point is that it's a lot of money. Yeah.
And it's competitive, and federal government, state government, it's always zero-sum game. Whatever Columbus doesn't get, somebody else will get. So who are the smart heads here who can help to part of the bigger picture? But we can't do anything without data. We can't grow faster than the data grows. And one of the difficult challenges we're going to approach here is we're talking about 2026. And we can't figure out 2022. Is it hard to say? I don't know where inflation is going to be. So there are a lot of challenges that are in front of us trying to put all these.
Mr. Chair, if I could, sorry, Commissioner, before I have to run for my next thing, I just wanted to say thank you again. I think the conversation you just had is exactly why we think we got a great team to have this discussion with us. And I think you all also understand why it's so important that, that there's not a council member on a commission like this, because we do need the input, and you're asking exactly the same questions that we wrestle with all the time. And I appreciate you so much for that. I appreciate the time, and I just want you to know that I'm always available. Mr. Davidson is always available, and we just want to help get through this together as a team so we get the best possible advice and guidance for our members. So thank you so much. We can't exceed your advice.
Okay, I think we've gotten a big issue here out on the table. We're not going to resolve anything today. We look forward to looking at some data, Greg. Commissioners, did you have any other items you wanted to discuss today? Naya, how about you?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Is there any other items you want to make sure we cover today?
I did not have anything, but City Attorney's Office, Robert, has something, so I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, just a point of process. You did review the minutes from the January meeting, but there needs to be a motion to approve them and a vote to approve
Okay,
them.
fine. Okay. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Now, how about telling us about our proposed agenda for our meeting 2 weeks from today?
I don't know, have that agenda directly in front of me because I gave that to you all last week, but I think next week we will be, not next week, excuse me, on February the 16th, we will be getting updates, hopefully from Mr. Beaverson on the HR surveys, and I want to say there's going to be some budget information that's going to be shared by Matt Erickson, if I'm remembering correctly. But those are the things that will be happening on the 16th. And so this discussion that you guys had today will be an ongoing discussion. Next week will be our third meeting, so we'll be at about the halfway point.
In 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, and our next meeting in the week after next, excuse me. That'll be our third meeting, so we'll be at about the halfway point, and we'll have 3 meetings left on the schedule as we have our current schedule. So I just want to make you all aware of that in case there's a need that you all feel to meet more frequently, or if there's information that you're needing more quickly. Mr. Beaverson is going to be working to get information to you as quickly as possible. And I've asked him to kind of, if he's able to kind of start analyzing the data, and so that I can kind of share that information with you all as it's coming in, versus kind of waiting until the end and then giving you the big list. There will be a big list, but just so you can start thinking about what you're seeing ahead of time.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, yes, ma'am.
Naya, did we confirm the meeting schedule? I thought that we still had to solidify, maybe not the dates, but at least the times. And if we've done that, I'm good. I just wanted to make sure.
We confirmed the dates. We didn't confirm the times. So if that is something, I know that we have been meeting at 10 a.m. If 10 a.m. works on the 16th for everyone still, I know that you already let me know that you will not be available on March 16th. Is there anyone else that wasn't here last week that has any issues with the set dates? I did send a calendar invite to you all that repeats every 2 weeks. But is everyone okay with 10 a.m. for the next meeting as it stands?
So would 10 a.m. On every other Wednesday as proposed work?
Well, I know that Commissioner Ingalls mentioned that sometimes that wouldn't work, that potentially wouldn't work for her.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that I would caution is that if we do meet in the evenings, it's a little bit easier to get bumped. So I would suggest meeting, if you're not able to do 10 a.m., maybe an afternoon meeting, maybe 2 p.m. Instead of an evening meeting, because council often has meetings. And so a lot of those meetings can kind of bump us out of our schedule. And so the during the day meetings are kind of the more helpful to making sure that we're able to keep a consistent meeting schedule and we're not getting bumped.
So Sarah, do you have a conflict on March the 16th? Is that right?
Is it possible just to move the meeting up? Even a half hour would be very helpful.
That's fine with me. So you're saying 9:30 rather than 10?
Yeah.
And for what
If
day
that's
is
okay.
that?
The 16th
The 16th of March?
of February.
Of February. Okay, so if it's agreeable to all, we'll hold our next meeting on Wednesday, February the 16th, here at City Hall at 9:30.
And I just want to make sure this is clear, that is only for the meeting on the 16th, or are you asking?
Yeah,
Okay.
for the meeting on the 16th. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes, I can edit that, that particular meeting invite, but I won't update the entire.
okay, so just to be clear, we're going to make that one change to 9:30 on the 16th, but we'll keep the 10 a.m. Meeting time for our other meetings
Yes.
as proposed? Okay, fine. Is there anything else to come before the commission? Commissioners, staff? Okay, if not, we're adjourned. Thank you.